This
Hello,
conference will
everyone.
now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. This is Kyra Esgate with America Service Commissions, and welcome to today's webinar on program evaluation. We're really excited to have representation from Volunteer Iowa to talk more about their planning grant evaluation process. And included in that is Sara, who is a staff member at Volunteer Iowa, as well as two evaluation consultants, Becky and Chavis. So we are going to go ahead and get started. We are recording today's session. We know that some folks today was a challenging day for them, so we want to make sure that we are able to share this information with the larger state commission network. I'm personally really excited to hear about the outcomes of this evaluation, as I know many of you have started to use planning grants really as a tool for you to develop new programs, especially because you continue to get increases in AmeriCorps formula dollars. And so I think it's great for us to hear about the lessons learned from the Iowa process from those that are on the call today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters today. I just want to remind everyone that if you can, to improve sound quality, to please put yourself on mute when you're not talking or asking questions. That would be super helpful. If not, I'll need to go ahead and mute everybody else for the sake of sound quality. But with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to the team at Volunteer Iowa.
Great. If you want to go ahead and advance one slide.
Of course.
And Sara, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Albright. I work as a program manager and program development consultant for Volunteer Iowa. I've been working with Volunteer Iowa for about 5 years in different roles for them, and now I'm a program manager. My specialty here is the planning grant process and managing a portfolio of AmeriCorps planning grants and new AmeriCorps programs for Volunteer Iowa. And so I'm happy to be on this call today and share what we have done as a result of our evaluation. Becky, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Becky Eason, and Chavis, Lickvar-Armstrong, and I are here in Kansas. We have been working with the great folks in Iowa for a couple of years now, doing training and technical assistance with their grantees on, particularly on issues around evaluation, performance measures, writing your evaluation plan, those kinds of things. I have my own company called WordCraft, and through this company, we do evaluations as well as training and technical assistance.
Yeah, and I'm Chavis Lickvar-Armstrong. I'm a research project coordinator at the University of Kansas, and as part of that job, I write grants, manage grants and projects, and then I also conduct evaluations or work with external evaluators who are assessing our programs. So it's really fun for me to be able to step into another program's shoes and think about what I would do if this were my program and if I were evaluating it or if I were looking to assess kind of our impact. So I've just had a lot of fun working with the folks from Iowa and with Becky and helping program directors and staff plan for their evaluations.
All right, there we go. Sara?
Yeah, so we thought we would start by just going over how we do planning grants here in Iowa. So we select planning grants 3 times a year. We have a slightly different application for planning grants than we do for our formula and competitive grants. After a planning grant is selected, we set it up in 2 phases. We have what we call phase 1, which is really the designing of the program and ensuring that the organization has enough capacity to eventually run an AmeriCorps program. And then phase 2, and I should mention that phase 1 is typically about 6 months and starts September 1st. And phase 2 is where we spend time with organizations preparing to implement an AmeriCorps program. So we work on areas like host site development, how the program will be staffed, We make sure that they have all of their systems in place to recruit, train, and manage members for startup. So that's where we really start digging into how program implementation would work. We initially, as I said, the phase 1 is usually 6 months. We initially commit to funding for 6 months. However, we do give them the opportunity, if they've been successful through phase 1, and we feel pretty confident at that point that they will go on to become an operational AmeriCorps program. We will give them the opportunity to extend for 6 more months. Usually the extension does not come with additional funds. However, if they do need additional funds, we definitely hear them out. But usually it's a no-cost extension that we give them for phase 2. Next, please. So why did we choose to evaluate this process? Well, for starters, we've had more dedicated resources, more grants awarded and dedicated resources for planning grants. So, anytime you invest in more, we certainly want to know what's working and what's not working well. But also, historically, we've had a 50% attrition rate for our planning grants. So about half of them decide not to, and what we mean by attrition is not that they necessarily drop out of the planning grant process, but that they don't go on to apply for an operational program. So we also want to improve upon that. And so we thought we could do an evaluation and see what we can learn from it. Since we have more dedicated resources for planning grants, we now have a staff member dedicated to them, which is me. So it just seemed like a good opportunity to evaluate the process and see if we could act upon any recommendations. So that's sort of a quick summary of why we wanted to do the evaluation in the first place.
All right, this is Becky, taking back over for a little bit here. So we came up with 3 questions that drove the evaluation work that we did for Iowa. And the first one is, what organizational characteristics should influence the selection process? So what is it about an organization that Volunteer Iowa should be looking for when they select them to get a planning grant, which should help with the attrition process in the long run? And then the next one was about timing. When and how should the awards be distributed? When during the application cycle would be the right time to get the award? How long should the funding opportunity last? To make sure that they're getting the money at the right time to use it effectively, to make that decision to go ahead and apply for a full application. And then what types of activities should the funder support? Which activities could be supported that would have the greatest impact on the success of a planning grantee? Again, the whole idea being, if we're going to support them in this planning process, we want to be supporting programs that will be successful in writing a full-blown application and eventually getting some AmeriCorps staff. So those were the questions that we used to drive the overall drive the evaluation. Next.
So we were very lucky to get a lot of contact information from Volunteer Iowa. They put us in connection with their planning grantees dating back to 2014. And then Volunteer Iowa also shared surveys that they had collected over the years from planning grantees regarding their experience with the process. So we just had a leg up when we started this process. And what we did was we reached out to all of the planning grantees, some of whom were now program directors, some of whom were not, and we kind of fielded which ones would be willing to talk to us over the phone, which ones would be willing to answer a few questions over email, which ones might participate in a survey, and which ones would actually be willing to host us at their site to see what their program is doing now. So we really drew a lot of qualitative data from this process. We found that to be the most compelling data to really answer the questions that Becky shared with you in the last slide. So most of the data we got came from surveys, interviews, or site visits. Our timeline for this was January of this year, and then we submitted our final evaluation report in August. We did site visits in Iowa with the programs over March, which was convenient for a lot of them because those who work on a university schedule had spring break at that time, so they were really diving into a lot of their work in the office and were able to kind of show me what was going on. So yeah, we really relied on a lot of qualitative data primarily for this process.
Okay, next. All right, what we've got here are some of the questions that we asked the programs. And we were trying to get at three things through these questions. First of all, what was their experience as a planning grant recipient? And then second, what about the process was helpful? And third, what could be improved in the process to make the experience more valuable for future planning grant recipients? And so we've got the questions here that we used in different iterations, whether it was on over the phone interview or an in-person site visit, or we did an online survey that we'll talk about in a bit. But you can see how these questions get at the challenges that they might have faced, the support that they received, was the process helpful? You can go ahead and advance. A couple more questions here. What factors were barriers to their completion of the application, if there were any? And then that would you apply again is always a great question to get people thinking broadly about the experience. Then sometimes even people who might have had, maybe they weren't entirely positive were like, well, yeah, but I would do it again because I was able to get X or Y. And then what recommendations would they have to make the process better? And so these questions are what we used with the applicants themselves to gather the information. As Chavis said, it was primarily qualitative because it's so much about their experiences. There's really not a quantitative measure that's going to get at that. Next. All right. So here are some of our findings, and I'm going to pass it back to Chavis.
So some of the things that we learned during this process, we were able to kind of categorize into kind of 4 broad categories: recruiting, selecting, funding, and then supporting. So I'm going to talk about what we learned regarding the recruiting and selecting process. And the first thing was that only a few grantees spoke of service as critical action through which they would address the needs that they were trying to meet in their communities. And those grantees that really focused in on service as that critical action, there was definitely a greater success rate in whether they found the process to be not only helpful but invigorating, and then whether they were able to write a successful application after the planning process. I learned through talking to the applicants that many of the applicants that were new to AmeriCorps saw compliance and progress monitoring requirements as barriers to success. I don't think that that's new to anybody who works supporting AmeriCorps grantees. There's a lot that goes into making sure your program is successful. So for those who are new, that was just a surprise.
Surprise. Go ahead and advance. So recommendations based on the findings about recruiting and selecting. really that first one may be in some ways the most important one, that applicants who are committed to the AmeriCorps service model were more likely to be successful. So if you have somebody who's applying, even if they have a great nonprofit, and what they're thinking of is, oh, AmeriCorps is a great way to get an inexpensive person to come work for me, that is not going to be, that's not a successful model. And that's probably not of any surprise to you, but it was an interesting finding about this planning grant process, that all the way down to the planning grant process, it really matters if they're committed to this concept of service. And similarly, that applicants who are committed to making sure that their AmeriCorps members are invested and are being used to as a catalyst for community change, that the role that they have selected for their AmeriCorps volunteers or their AmeriCorps members is to make positive change in the community. Again, it's a mindset that ended up to be really important to the success of these planning grant recipients. And then on the more practical side, oh yeah, one last thing there. That's okay. Applicants who have had experience managing grants and understand going in that there are going to be these progress monitoring, compliance, filling out of forms. Those of us who live in the grant world understand that that's just part of the business. But if you're new to federal funding, that can come as a surprise,
a shock to the system,
a shock, right? And so, again, you want to select programs that are exciting and new, but if you want to be successful, if you can also pair that with some experience with federal funding, that will guarantee more successful applicants. And now you can move on.
So when it came to funding and supporting those kind of broad topics, we found that gap that Sara talked about in funding between the two during phase 2 was certainly problematic for some of the planning grantees. They just either didn't anticipate that it would be a 6-month wait in between planning and then implementation. There were a lot of factors that went into that, but that gap in funding was something that was talked about quite a bit when we were gathering this information. Many of the grantees viewed program planning and the compliance tasks as being completely unrelated. So when Sara was talking about phase 1 and phase 2, some of the grantees were fully anticipating the phase 1 components, but when it came down to phase 2, where they're being challenged to create these forms, create a hiring application, create, surveys, have all of these things ready, start working on these things now, I think that was a little bit surprising to them, and they didn't see the value in it right away. So for some, that was a problem, and for others, it was absolutely it was completely useful. It was the thing that helped them truly be prepared to then write their formula grant. So another point that I learned as I was talking to these grantees was that they almost across the board, having access to form templates and examples was something that they thought would be just a benefit overall. Take a little bit of the legwork out of preparing all of those things. Again, some were brand new to this process, so when they were tasked with creating forms, they just didn't even know where to begin. So almost everyone requested some sort of access to templates and examples of forms. Also, as a support measure, grantees across the board said that having a program director or a former planning grantee as a mentor would be helpful during this process. And so we made some recommendations regarding how those supports could be provided in the future if they aren't at this time.
Next. All right, so the recommendations really come right out of those findings. So, and some of these, one of them Sara has already addressed. So expanding the funding timeline so that there isn't a gap between the planning grant and the full-fledged funding, or providing them some sort of counseling so that they can allocate their funds and then there won't be a gap. Because if you've shifted your staffing around to accommodate this planning grant and then the eventual full grant, and then there's no funding, that can be a bit problematic. Connecting the dots between the compliance activities and the program development goals. So if they understand better why they need to do the compliance activities, then they're more likely to comply. They're more likely to go ahead and follow through, not get as frustrated, not throw in the towel. So if they understand why they're doing what they're doing, it's going to be more successful. And then, if they would like example forms and templates, then having a bank of those available to them so that they're not starting from scratch. There might still be some iterative steps in there where they have to do multiple versions, but they won't do as many iterations of the form and survey or whatever if they've started from something that's already been approved. And then providing those networking opportunities with other planning grantees or through some sort of mentoring program so that they have someone. I mean, Sara's lovely and they can ask lots of questions of her, but sometimes it feels really reassuring to talk to somebody else who's right where you are or who has been where you are and can support you in that manner as well. All right, next. So here are some of the limitations that we ran into as we were conducting this evaluation. The first one is just timing. That, as Chavis mentioned, we were able to get access to information on programs that had applied to the planning grant process as far back as 2012. And so we're asking them to remember something that's a number of years ago. They may not even have any paperwork left on it at this point, particularly programs that did not go ahead and apply for full funding. Are not likely to remember much to share, although they shared what they could. And then the next one, again, a time thing, was that the people we were interviewing oftentimes were not in the same role as they were when they applied for the planning grant. I mean, if it was 5 years ago and they were a program manager then and the executive director now, their role has changed so much that their knowledge is going to be limited. And then, as Sara mentioned, this is an evolving process, and so changes have been made in the time frame that we had to evaluate. So grantees at different points had experienced different things, and the ones who've gotten the funds a number of years ago certainly experienced a different process than what is in place now or was in place, at the beginning of 2018. So the timing thing presented some challenges to what we were able to gather, but we were still able to get some good data. So next.
Yeah, so I'll talk about what worked well. The thing that I think really worked well for us as evaluators is that we had an established relationship with many of the people we were talking to, because as we mentioned at the beginning of this call or webinar, we had worked with program directors and staff already to help them with their evaluation process. So they knew us, they were happy to see us, they were happy to talk to us, they were excited that we were kind of asking them these questions. And many of the people that really gave us the most valuable information are dedicated to seeing not just their program, but every AmeriCorps program do well. And so they were excited that Volunteer Iowa was sending evaluators out to talk to them about the process and with the intention of making it better. So having that established relationship, I think, just really led to higher quality of data and better response rates. I also think that meeting in person was critical, and getting a chance to see the programs in action really helped us better understand the context with which some of the answers were given. because every program, as you all know, every AmeriCorps program is so different. They operate different and they're working towards different goals. So when you're looking at a survey response, it's hard to really know where that response is coming from, especially if it's something that's speaking to a challenge or a great success. It's like, well, what about that was challenging for your program? Because for another program, it wasn't a challenge. So being there in person, talking to them face to face, being able to follow up with questions when clarity was needed, and then also just seeing kind of the action that goes on day to day really provided the context needed to make good recommendations. Planning an evaluation that is driven by qualitative data also, I think, is in your best interest if you're a state volunteer commission that is thinking about doing an evaluation on one of your processes. When you talk to your evaluators, make sure they're skilled and willing and have the time to be able to gather this qualitative data, because I don't think that just doing surveys or just trying to gather data that's not face-to-face and doesn't have some more context to it will give you as meaningful of recommendations as what we were able to get. The reason I say that is because a lot of the recommendations we provided in this report to Volunteer Iowa actually came from the grantees themselves. We were able to put it in context because we have that experience and mindset as evaluators, but the really valuable recommendations come from the people who do the work. And so we were able to get that by going out and talking to them face to face.
Next.
Okay. Hi, this is Sara. So I'm going to talk about some of the recommendations that Becky and Chavis have mentioned that we've taken action on so far, and some of the things that we're still in the process of implementing. So we have moved forward on some of the recommendations to streamline our communications. We had been thinking of some of these things for a little while, and the evaluation report really helped confirm our thinking. So that was really good for us. It was really validating. So some of the things that we've done, we now have weekly 30-minute check-in calls with planning grants and their program officer. We hold monthly calls with other members of the Volunteer Iowa team, such as our compliance officer and our senior program officer who handles budget issues. We've tried to consolidate points of contact as best we can when communicating with planning grants. We also, at the start of the planning grants this year, for the first time, we did on-site visits with them. They were mostly focused on financial technical assistance, but we also did spend some time on the programmatic side. Just in general, I think we have provided more technical assistance this year and are working to communicate more about the phases. As Becky mentioned towards the beginning, there was some confusion among past planning grants about the way we've set up the phases, and so we've tried to address that early on and expand our funding timeline to try to explain so that they understand about the potential gap in funding for phase 2. We also have now a dedicated place on our Volunteer Iowa website for planning grants, and in that space, we have a link to several sample forms and templates. So we have set up this bank of sample forms and templates for our planning grants to use. And so far, we've received some really positive feedback from the current grantees. We also are trying to be more intentional about shadow opportunities. We are planning, especially during our phase 2 period, to have more of those opportunities as the planning grantees work to implement an AmeriCorps program. So, for example, we've given them the opportunity to attend a member orientation so that as they're developing their orientation and training plans, they will have actually seen one of those. Also, after we got this report from Becky and Chavis, we've been more aware of the need to connect program development with compliance, and we're trying to communicate that better. We spent some time on this during our planning grant orientation that we held in September, so that we could better connect the two areas for folks. And finally, one thing I thought of as Becky was talking earlier is that we also have spread out some of our due dates for our start forms. One of the things that came out of the report was around compliance barriers to success. So we've tried where we can to spread out some of those forms so it's not quite as overwhelming for planning grantees. Next. So we haven't implemented everything. Some of it's a process. So here are some things that we are still working on post-evaluation. The first is the mentoring program that pairs AmeriCorps members with planning grantees. We do really want to do this. It's just taken us a little time to get this up and running. But right now we are in the process of selecting existing AmeriCorps programs to serve as mentors for our planning grantees during the phase 2 period. And again, this phase 2 period for us is when they start putting plans in place to run a program. We're also providing an incentive for the programs to participate. So more to come on that. Hopefully, I mean, we're excited about it. I think we would like to get it launched early next year, hopefully in January. We're also still working out the building capacity for planning grant piece. Becky mentioned just, you know, some of the challenges that come with organizations that haven't had federal grant experience. And so we're still kind of looking at what we can do to help build their capacity through the planning grant stage. This year we did have a pre-award letter for the first time, and so we're collecting more data earlier, kind of that baseline data that we could look at TA needs and how we might build phases for the planning grant process around capacity development. So we're still kind of thinking about the possibility of realigning our phases, but we haven't done and taken any action on that. We're just kind of still thinking about how that may work. And we're also thinking about the piece that Becky mentioned earlier around recruiting applicants that are committed to service, and how we can kind of front load that more in our application process. We are, as I mentioned with the previous slides, we are really providing much more technical assistance early on with planning grantees, and I think we're really trying to reiterate, you know, this is what this is all about, you know, AmeriCorps members' service to communities. So we're just haven't really figured out how we could build that into our application yet, but we are actively working on that with our planning grantees. Next. So that sums up our presentation. Unless Becky and Chavis, you want to add anything further, we can open it up for questions.
I don't think we have anything to add. It's really nice to see what the next steps are and that the evaluation has been useful. And I commend Volunteer Iowa for evaluating their process. I think that shows a dedication to those grantees being successful. It's been great to work on it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really good for us too. As I said, we were thinking of some things, but seeing your work really helped get us in gear and really, start making some good changes. And so it was just really reassuring and reaffirming for us to see, and also just to see the way you laid out all of the recommendations. It really was very beneficial for us.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing all of this content today. I think this is really, really valuable and hopefully will help inform other commissions as they think about doing evaluations of planning grants. Because again, I think that this is an emerging, and actually probably more than emerging, I think it's a very common strategy for commissions right now. So it's great to hear some of this kind of feedback and lessons learned. So I want to go ahead and open it up to questions. So do any of our participants on today's call have any questions for our presenters?
Hi, this is Laura Thompson. Go ahead. I'm from Serve Washington, and we're doing planning grants this year for the first time in a number of years. So it's really great to hear your lessons learned and the evaluations that you've done. I think this will be really helpful. I'll be sure to pass this along to our other staff. And I'm sorry if you covered this, but I didn't quite catch. I was trying to understand. In the beginning, you said there was about a 50% attrition rate. Was that programs that started the planning grantees and then didn't finish the process? And if that's the case, like they kind of dropped out and didn't even finish the planning grant phase, were some of them included in the interviews and surveys?
So this is Sara. I'll take the first part of your question, and then I'll let Becky and Chavis speak to whether or not they talked to folks who had dropped out. So when we say about a 50% attrition rate, we're thinking of the planning grantees that finished phase 1 with us, but then never applied for a full AmeriCorps program. So
Okay.
we consider it, we want to improve upon that, because after we've spent time and dedicated resources for 6 months, we hope that they will apply for a program. However, there are some that, it's kind of was a good thing because they realized that it wasn't for them. And so, some of those cases where, it's good for them to figure that out before they move on. But certainly we invest in them because we want them to be a program. So yes, we're looking at people that went through phase 1, but then never went to phase 2 and never applied for a program. Becky and Chavis, do you want to talk about whether or not you talked to folks who did drop out of the or didn't apply for a program?
Yes, we tried. We created an online survey, very short, 5 questions or less, and sent it out via email. But the return rate on that was so very low. You're talking to programs that really, I was going to say backed out, but that's not a very good word.
Well, as I recall too, one thing that so Volunteer Iowa was awesome about getting us contact information for everybody who's applied for a planning grant in the last several years. I think there were 1 or 2 that we were able to speak with via email who answered a few very basic questions about the experience and why they didn't complete beyond phase 1. And a lot of it did have to do with the fact that they just realized they didn't have the capacity as an organization to manage an AmeriCorps grant at this time. What did emerge in our conversations with other planning grantees that did complete and then did go on to apply for formula funding, and I think for the most part they successfully then operated an AmeriCorps program, was that a few of them had participated in planning grants long before the planning grant that led to this successful program. And so there were a few people who I talked to who did apply for planning grants and did not, as a result, learned what their limitations were and then did not apply for funding after that. But then they came back a couple of years later after they had kind of worked through those limitations, applied for a planning grant again, or applied for a competitive or a formula grant, and we're operating a program now. So the planning grant, for the most part, in those cases at least, was still extremely valuable, even if they didn't complete past phase one.
Did that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
Beth, did you have a question?
I did, yeah. Thanks, Kyra. So this is Beth McGinnis in Massachusetts, and this has been really helpful. We're kind of in our second year of kind of reintroducing planning grants for all the same reasons that Kyra was talking about before. But I think we're really looking at how to bring a little bit more structure to the process when we do have planning grants that we're actively working with. But also we have just found the biggest barrier is what you were talking about earlier about somebody who really buys into the AmeriCorps model, not just that they're looking for warm bodies. And so I guess I have two questions. One is sort of on that initial stage. I think you get a lot from conversations with people, but I'm wondering if as part of your formal application process, you have any way that you're screening for that. That's been helpful. We certainly sometimes see it in those conversations, but I'm just curious if you've figured out a way to try to identify that in another way. And then the second part of my question is more around once you have people, you know, having weekly calls and monthly calls, is there like a particular sort of framework or order that you're kind of taking people through to hit all of those different pieces? Because I think that's the piece that we're really thinking about, is how to formalize that process so that everybody kind of gets the same support, but that we're covering all the pieces that we feel like we need to.
Okay, hi, this is Sara. I'll take this one. So these are both really good questions. As far as, you know, getting that buy-in into the AmeriCorps model early, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and you know, one of the things I mentioned earlier was how we have spaced out some of the start form requirements for planning grants, and have really tried to push some of those later. And part of that is exactly as you say, you know, we want organizations that don't see it as warm bodies, but see it as, you know, service to their community. And we want them to love the program before they see all of the paperwork requirements and so on. And so, you know, I don't want to say it's a bait and switch, because certainly that has a negative connotation with it, but we want them to really appreciate what the program can do, and to be inspired by it and have that vision before we hit them with a lot of paperwork. So we have spaced some of that out. We do spend a lot of time on that in the planning grant orientation. We restructured it this year to focus more on the AmeriCorps model. Last year, we spent the orientation talking a lot about what would be required of them through the two phases, and we realized that's not really a very inspiring way to start. And so we have restructured that. As far as the application process, sort of how you screen for this, that's kind of one of the things I said that's in process. We're still trying to figure out how to do that better, because it is really important. I think the planning grantees that have gone on definitely had that buy-in and really believed in what the program can do. So we're still looking at the application. And I'm, by the way, happy to share materials with anyone that's interested. As far as the weekly calls and a framework we use, we have something called a planning grant timeline that outlines when everything is due through the year. And it is focused a lot on task and start forms, but it helps them kind of see what will be asked during the year and what kinds of things they should be working on as the year progresses. And so our weekly calls are usually structured in such a way where we check in where we are in the calendar, and we talk about the things that are coming due and whether they have any questions. And typically I'll start off with a few updates about things that are timely for them, and then the rest of the time is for them to ask any questions. Sometimes it's related to something that's coming due, and sometimes it's they're starting to think through their model more, and they'll ask, a specific question on member activities and those kinds of things. So we do keep them at 30 minutes because I think that's important, so we're not wearing these planning grantees out. But it's a good productive 30 minutes. And once in a while, they'll ask for a longer work session around, like especially around their budgets as they're trying to think through their budgets and how to meet their cost per MSY. Sometimes we'll have work sessions on those kinds of topics. But I'm happy to share anything you're interested in, Beth.
That would be great. Thank you.
Sara, this is Kyra. I had one question for you in regards to the current portfolio in Volunteer Iowa. And you may not know this, and if you don't know this off the top of your head, no worries, but just curious about what percentage of your current portfolio programs actually went through the planning grant process in some way, shape, or form. I know we heard earlier that some folks did it earlier and then kind of took a little bit of break before coming to get an operating grant, but I was wondering if you have a sense of kind of what percentage of your portfolio went through a planning grant process of some sort.
Good question. I know for our new ones this year, we have 3 new programs, and one of them went through the planning grant process. But as far as our existing programs, I would have to take a look to see, if and when they did have planning grants. I know 2 of them that are in their second year, because I worked with them, also had planning grants. But I'd have to look at the portfolio as a whole to give you an exact percentage. It has been interesting.
Worries.
It has been interesting to see the new programs. Two of them are in my portfolio, and one of them did not have a planning grant, and one of them did. And I can really see a big difference as far as where they're starting with their knowledge base. It's really the new program. I mean, the one that did not have a planning grant is doing fantastic, but it was a lot the first 2 months for them. I mean, everything was new. So it does seem like the planning grantees or the former planning grants really have a leg up on implementing programs.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That was kind of going to be my follow-up question, is that for those that did receive planning grants versus those that didn't, are you seeing a difference in the implementation? Because I think that that's a really important consideration for commissions as well in all of this. So not to say that an applicant couldn't come in without a planning grant and be successful, but the learning curve and just kind of some of the preparation for a lot of the paperwork and other things that we heard about today too seems to me would be more challenging for them. So that's interesting.
Yes, absolutely. I think the ones that had planning grants, from my experience, they definitely hit the ground much faster on recruitment. The ones that are new that did not, they're spending a lot of the early months just, getting everything in place to run a program. And so lots more technical assistance has been needed with them, just because, as you know, there's a lot that goes with running an AmeriCorps program. So yeah, you're right. I think especially in recruitment is where I see a big difference.
Yeah, that makes sense, certainly. Great. Other questions for our presenters today?
This is Becky. I just wanted to throw out there that Sara mentioned that she's available to talk offline or other in other venues. If anybody has any questions for Chavis or I, feel free to drop me an email or give me a call, and we would be happy to talk further about the work that we did with them. So we're available.
That's great. Thank you. Any last questions? Okay, so as I shared at the beginning of today's webinar, we have recorded this webinar, so we'll get the webinar recording out to all of you. So if you want to access it or share it with any of your colleagues, you're welcome to do so. We'll also share a PDF version of the PowerPoint as well, so you have those slides. Again, want to take a moment to thank our 3 presenters today. Again, I think this is really valuable information and really timely for so many commissions that are really thinking through planning grants and how they can be a strategy to build their portfolios. And I am to remind everyone that our next program evaluation call will be Friday, February 1st, so a ways away, although I'm sure it'll be here before we know it, and that will be at noon Eastern time. So more information about that call will be forthcoming as we get closer. But again, thank you to our presenters. Thanks to everyone for joining today's call, and hope that you have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.